The wind howled like a wounded beast across the endless prairie, whipping the snow into furious spirals that stung the skin and blinded the eyes. Winter had come early this year, and it had come with a vengeance. The land, usually so wide and open under the big blue sky, had turned into a white prison, swallowing everything in its path, trees, hills, even the distant mountains, all lost beneath the endless, swirling storm. Inside her small, sturdy cabin, Eliza tightened her shawl around her shoulders and stirred the pot of thin broth simmering over the fire. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It had been 2 years since her husband had ridden out with the other men to defend the settlement from raiders. 2 years since she had watched him disappear into the dust, never to return. Now, the silence of the wilderness was her only companion, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the relentless scream of the wind outside. She knew she should be grateful for the shelter, for the thick log walls that kept out the worst of the cold, for the small stock of food she had carefully stored away. But gratitude was hard to find in the emptiness. The Bible on the table lay open to the book of Psalms, the words blurring before her tired eyes. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She whispered the verse, but the words felt hollow. What did it mean to not want when loneliness gnawed at her bones like the cold gnawed at the land? Then, faint, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, a sound cut through the storm. Not the wind, not the creaking of the cabin. A cry, a baby's cry. Eliza froze, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. There was no one for miles. No settlers. No travelers foolish enough to be caught in this blizzard. And yet, there it was again. Weak, desperate, barely audible over the storm. Her heart hammered. It was madness to go out there. The cold would kill her in minutes if she lost her way. But what if someone, what if a child, was out there dying in the snow? She moved before she could think, pulling on her heavy coat, wrapping a scarf over her face, and thrusting her hands into thick mittens. The door groaned against the wind as she pushed it open, and the storm roared in her ears, biting at her skin like 1,000 needles. Snow lashed at her face as she stumbled forward, following that fragile, trembling cry. Step by step, she fought her way through the drifts, her boots sinking deep with every movement. The world had turned into a swirling white nightmare, and for a terrible moment, she feared she had imagined the sound. Then there, a dark shape in the snow. Not a fallen branch, not a rock. A bundle wrapped in furs. Eliza fell to her knees, her mittened hands brushing away the snow. And there, nestled in the frozen folds, was a baby. Tiny, his face blue with cold, his breath coming in weak, shuddering gasps. His dark eyes, barely open, locked onto hers, and in that moment, something inside her cracked wide open. She didn't know where he had come from, didn't know who had left him here, or why. But one thing was certain. If she left him, he would die. Cradling him against her chest, she turned back toward the cabin, the wind shrieking in her ears like a warning. This child was Comanche. She could see it in the beadwork on the wrapping, in the shape of his features. Her husband had died fighting Comanche raiders. The settlers would say she was a fool for saving him. They would say it was dangerous. But as she stepped back inside, the warmth of fire wrapping around them like a prayer, she knew she could not turn away. Kneeling by the hearth, she peeled off the frozen furs, rubbing life back into his tiny limbs. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know what you're doing, but I trust you." And outside, the storm raged on. The fire crackled on the hearth, its orange glow flickering against the rough wooden walls of the cabin, casting long, trembling shadows that danced like restless spirits. Outside, the storm still raged, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls, rattling the shutters and moaning through cracks in the log walls. But inside, for the first time in years, the silence had been broken, not by the creak of floorboards or the lonely sigh of the wind, but by the soft, uneven breath of a child now wrapped in Eliza's only good quilt. She had named him Little Hawk, not because she knew his true name, but because when she had first laid eyes on him, half buried in the snow, his tiny fists had clenched like the talons of a bird of prey, clinging to life with a fierceness that defied the cold. Now, as she knelt beside the hearth, dipping a scrap of cloth into warm water to drip onto his lips, she marveled at how something so small, could carry such a weight of fate. His skin, still too pale from the cold, was slowly warming, the bluish tint fading into the deep, rich brown of the Comanche people. His dark eyes, half lit with exhaustion, watched her with a quiet intensity, as if he were trying to understand why this stranger with the pale face and trembling hands had pulled him from the snow. Eliza's own hands shook, not just from the lingering chill, but from the enormity of what she had done. She had brought a Comanche child into her home, a child whose people had raided settlements, whose warriors had killed her husband. What have I done? The thought slithered through her mind like a snake, cold and unwelcome. But then Little Hawk coughed, a weak, pitiful sound, and his tiny fingers curled around the edge of the quilt, gripping it as though it were the only thing tethering him to this world. And in that moment, Eliza knew she could no more cast him out than she could stop her own heart from beating. She had barely slept in 3 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the storm outside, heard the phantom cries of a child that might not have been real. Every time Little Hawk stirred, she was at his side, pressing a hand to his forehead to check for fever, dribbling broth between his lips when he would take it. The settler's warnings echoed in her mind like a grim refrain. They'll come for him, and when they do, they won't ask kindly. But Eliza had lived alone on the prairie long enough to know that fear was a poor counselor. She had learned to trust the quiet voice inside her, the one that sounded like her mother's prayers, like the verses she read each night by candlelight. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. The words settled over her like a mantle, heavy but comforting. Then came the knock, not the soft tap of a neighbor, not the hesitant rap of a lost traveler. This was a heavy, deliberate sound, the kind that made the door tremble in its frame. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Little Hawk, sensing her sudden stillness, let out a small, questioning whimper. Slowly, she stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. The firelight glinted off the rifle hanging above the hearth. Her husband's, untouched since the day he had ridden out. She could reach for it. She should reach for it. But something, that same quiet voice, whispered otherwise. She crossed the room, her hand hovering over the latch. Then, with a breath that felt like a prayer, she opened the door. The cold rushed in, but it was nothing compared to the sight before her. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with years of wind and war, stood on her doorstep. Behind him, just visible through the swirling snow, were others, many others, warriors. His eyes, dark as flint, locked onto hers. Then, without a word, they flicked past her to the bundle in the crib by the fire, to Little Hawk. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment the settlers had warned her about, the moment her kindness would be repaid with violence. But then the man did something she did not expect. He bowed his head, and in a voice rough with emotion, he spoke a single word, one she did not know, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Thank you. The wind had died to a whisper. The last gust of the blizzard sighing to the pines like a retreating army. Dawn bled pink and gold across the snow-laden prairie, painting the world in fragile light. But Eliza did not see the beauty of the morning. All she saw were the warriors. So many warriors, their breath curling white in the cold air, their dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her bones ache. The man who had spoken stood closest, his face a map of hard lines and older scars, his bearing that of a leader. His furs were dusted with snow, his hands, rough and battle-worn, hung loose at his sides, but there was no mistaking the power coiled beneath his stillness. This was a man who had seen war, who had dealt death and carried his weight without buckling. And yet, when his gaze fell upon Little Hawk, something in his face shifted, like stone giving way to water. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears. She had imagined this moment 100 times in the sleepless nights since she'd found the child, visions of painted faces and raised weapons, of her cabin burning, of her own body left for the wolves. But this quiet, this terrible, trembling quiet, it was worse. The warrior took a single step forward. Eliza's fingers twitched toward the doorframe, bracing. But he did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he lifted his hands, palms open, and spoke again, his voice low and thick with something she had not expected to hear, grief. "My son," he said in halting English. The word struck her like a blow. His son. Of course. The beadwork on the baby's wrappings. The careful way he had been left. Not abandoned, not discarded, but lost. The storm had stolen him, and the storm had brought him to her. Little Hawk stirred in his crib, letting out a small, sleepy sound. The warrior's eyes flickered at the noise, his breath catching. Eliza saw it then, the raw, unguarded hope in his face. The love. It was a look she recognized. It was the same way her husband had gazed at their own child, years ago, before the fever took her. A murmur ran through the warriors behind him. One younger, with a hawk's sharp eyes and a bow clutched tight in his hands, took a step forward, his mouth twisting. He spat a word in his own tongue, sharp as a knife. The leader, Storm Voice, Eliza realized that must be his name, snapped something back without turning, his voice like cracking ice. The younger man flinched but did not retreat. Eliza understood then. Not all of them wanted this to end peacefully. Her throat tightened. She could still reach for the rifle. She could still bar the door, could still fight. But what would that prove? That she was as fearful as the settlers who whispered about savages in the dark? That she believed the worst of these men before they had even acted? Little Hawk whimpered again, his small fists clutching at the air. Without thinking, Eliza turned and lifted him from the crib, cradling him against her chest. His tiny body was warm now, his breath sweet with sleep. When she faced Storm Voice again, the warrior's gaze was locked on the child, his face a storm of emotions, relief, longing, sorrow. She could keep him. She could clutch Little Hawk to her chest and refuse to let go. She could claim him as her own, could raise him far from the battles and bloodshed between their peoples. But that would make her a thief. And Eliza was many things, lonely, afraid, weary, but she was not a thief. Holding the baby tight, she stepped forward, out into the cold morning light. The warriors tensed, hands drifting toward weapons. Storm Voice did not move. Eliza took another step, then another, until she stood before him, close enough to see the frost in his lashes, the pulse beating in his throat. "I kept him safe," she said softly. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Storm Voice reached out. His hands, so large and scarred, were impossibly gentle as they took the child from her arms. Little Hawk blinked up at his father, his tiny fingers grasping at the man's braids. Storm Voice closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to his son's, his shoulders trembling. When he looked at Eliza again, there were no words. None were needed. Behind him, the younger warrior hissed something, his grip tightening on his bow. Storm Voice turned, his voice a whip-crack of command. The man flinched but held his ground, his eyes burning with defiance. Eliza held her breath. This was the moment. This was where it would all unravel, where the fragile peace would shatter. But then Storm Voice did something unexpected. He reached out, not for a weapon, but to clasp Eliza's hand. His palm was rough, warm, his grip firm. "You are brave," he said, the English words heavy but clear. "You are, friend." And just like that, the world shifted. The silence that followed Storm Voice's words was not the quiet of tension or mistrust, but something deeper, something fragile and new, like the first thin ice forming over a winter stream, holding its breath against the coming thaw. Eliza stood motionless, her hand still clasped in the warrior's, the weight of his gratitude pressing down on her like a physical thing. Behind him, the other Comanche watched, their faces unreadable, their weapons no longer bristling with threat, but not yet laid aside. The young warrior who had protested earlier glowered, his fingers twitching near the knife at his belt, but he did not speak again. Little Hawk cooed softly in his father's arms, his tiny fingers tangled in the furs draped across Storm Voice's chest. The sound seemed to break the spell. The warrior released Eliza's hand and turned to his men, speaking in low, measured tones. Some nodded. Others cast wary glances toward the cabin, toward her, but none challenged him. Then Storm Voice did something Eliza could never have imagined. He gestured toward her home, the place where she had bared her grief and lived alone with her memories, and spoke a single word, "Enter." It was not a request. It was not a demand. It was an offering, Eliza's breath caught. She had seen the way settlers' cabins fared when the Comanche came. She had heard the stories of burning roofs and shattered doors. But this was different. This was permission. This was trust. She stepped back, holding the door open wide. Storm Voice ducked his head and crossed the threshold, his presence filling the small space like a sudden flame. The other warriors remained outside, though a few drifted closer, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Inside, the fire still crackled on the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the frozen world beyond the walls. Storm Voice's gaze swept the room. The rough-hewn table, the Bible lying open, the quilt now empty of the child he held. His eyes lingered on the rifle above the mantel, then flicked back to Eliza. There was no accusation in his look, only understanding. He spoke again, his voice quieter now, as though the walls themselves demanded reverence. Eliza did not know his words, but she knew their meaning. "Thank you." Little Hawk squirmed, his dark eyes blinking up at his father, before settling on Eliza. A small, gummy smile spread across his face. Storm Voice saw it. Something unreadable passed behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he reached into the folds of his furs and withdrew a small bundle, a pouch of finely tanned leather, its surface adorned with intricate beadwork. He held out to Eliza. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then she took it, her fingers brushing against his. The leather was soft, warm for his body. Inside, she found dried meat, sweet berries, and a handful of nuts. Food for travel, food for survival. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. This was no small gift. This was a sharing of resources, a recognition of what she had done. This was a bridge between their worlds. Outside, the young warrior called out, his voice sharp with impatience. Storm Voice's jaw tightened, but he did not turn. Instead, he met Eliza's gaze and spoke a single word in English, laboring over the unfamiliar sounds. "Friend?" Eliza's throat tightened. She had not had a friend in so long. Then, with a final glance at Little Hawk, Storm Voice turned and strode back into the morning light. The warriors parted for him, their murmurs fading into the wind. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching as they mounted their horses, as they gathered themselves to leave. But before they rode out, Storm Voice paused. He looked back at her, his face unreadable, and raised a hand in farewell. And then they were gone, swallowed by the vast, white prairie. The cabin felt emptier than ever. The fire popped in the hearth, a sound like a sigh. Eliza clutched the pouch to her chest, its weight a reminder of what had just happened. She was not alone anymore, and that changed everything. The days that followed were unlike any Eliza had ever known. The prairie, once so vast and silent, now carried whispers of change, of footsteps where before there had been only wind, of voices where before there had been only her own. Storm Voice returned, not with warriors at his back, but alone, riding across the frosted grass at dawn with the patience of a man who knew the land as intimately as his own breath. At first, he came only to bring gifts, a rabbit, freshly skinned and ready for the pot, a blanket woven so tightly no winter chill could pierce it, a small knife with a handle of polished bone, its edge sharp enough to slice through fear. Eliza accepted them with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the strangeness of all. She had lived so long in the shadow of loss that kindness felt foreign, like a language she had once known but forgotten. But Storm Voice was patient. He did not rush her understanding. He would sit by her fire, his presence as steady as the flames, and speak in slow, measured words, some English, some Comanche, all wrapped in gestures that needed no translation. He told her of his people, of the way the buffalo moved with the seasons, of the stories the elders whispered beneath the stars. And Eliza, in turn, spoke of her own past, of the husband she had buried, of the child taken too soon by fever, of the God who had seemed so distant in her grief, but whose presence she now felt in the quiet between their words. Little Hawk thrived between them. The baby, who had once been so frail in the snow, now laughed as he clutched at Storm Voice's braids or tugged at Eliza's apron strings. He was a bridge between their worlds, a living reminder that love could grow even in the hardest ground. But not everyone saw it that way. Thomas, the nearest settler, rode over one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon. He dismounted with a frown, his eyes darting to the Comanche knife on Eliza's table, to the unfamiliar footprints in the dirt outside her door. "You're playing with fire," he said, his voice low. "That savage may smile at you now, but what happens when his kindness runs out?" Eliza's hand stilled on the dough she was kneading. She thought of the way Storm Voice had cradled Little Hawk the day before, singing to him in a voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. She thought of the way he had looked at her when she'd handed him a cup of tea, his dark eyes holding something warmer than gratitude. "Fear makes fools of us all, Thomas," she said quietly. "But I won't let it rule me any more." He left with a shake of his head, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he rode away. Eliza watched him go, her heart heavy. She knew the settlers' whispers would grow louder, knew that some would call her a traitor, others worse. But then Storm Voice stepped out from the shadow of the barn, where he had been repairing the fence. He had heard every word. His face was unreadable, but his hands, usually so sure, clenched at his sides. Eliza met his gaze. No words passed between them, but none were needed. The understanding was there, as plain as the sunrise. That night, as the fire burned low and Little Hawk slept soundly in his crib, Storm Voice reached across the table and took Eliza's hand. His palm was rough, his finger strong, but his touch was gentle. "I stay," he said simply. And Eliza, for the first time in years, let herself hope. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the prairie grass shimmering under a sky so vast and blue it seemed to stretch into eternity. Eliza stood by the window of her cabin, her fingers tracing the delicate beadwork along the sleeves of the dress Storm Voice's sister had brought for her, a gift of softened deerskin adorned with patterns that told stories of the earth and stars. It was nothing like the stiff, high-collared gown she had worn when she married her first husband in the little white church back east. This dress moved with her, whispering against her skin like a promise. Outside, the Comanche women worked with quiet efficiency, setting up benches of smooth logs, weaving garlands of wildflowers through branches of a young oak that stood at the edge of the clearing. The men had built a cooking pit, where the rich scent of roasting venison and sweet corn already curled into the air. Even some of the settlers had come, though they kept to the edges, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Thomas stood among them, his arms crossed, but he did not leave. Eliza's breath caught when she saw Storm Voice emerge from the trees. He wore a tunic of white buckskin, its edges fringed like falling rain, his hair loose save for two thin braids tied with strips of red cloth, the color of the morning sun. His face, usually so stern, was alight with something tender, something unguarded. When their eyes met across the clearing, the world seemed to still. Little Hawk, now toddling on sturdy legs, broke the spell. He barreled toward Storm Voice with a gleeful shout, his tiny moccasins kicking up dust. The warrior swept him up with a laugh, tossing him high into the air before settling him on his shoulders. The sight of them, father and son, so easy in their love, made Eliza's heart swell. The ceremony was a blending of worlds. Storm Voice's elder spoke first, his voice a deep rumble as he painted streaks of sacred ash across Eliza's forehead, welcoming her into the circle of their people. Then the traveling preacher, a gaunt man who had braved the wilderness to reach them, read from the Book of Ruth. "Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." When it came time to exchange vows, Storm Voice apprised them all. In halting but determined English, he pledged himself not just to Eliza, but to the life they would build together, to the fields they would sow, to the children they would raise, to the peace they would forge between their peoples. Eliza, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, promised to walk beside him through every storm, to honor his ways as he honored hers, to love him as fiercely as the prairie loved the sky. Then, before the gathered witnesses, Storm Voice draped a necklace of bear claws and turquoise around her throat, a symbol of protection, of strength. And Eliza, in turn, fastened a silver cross around his neck, the metal warm from her hands. The feast that followed lasted long into the night. The Comanche drummers set a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat, their songs weaving with the settlers' fiddles until the music became something entirely new. Even the most reluctant settlers found themselves clapping along, their feet tapping as children from both peoples twirled together in the firelight. As the moon rose high, Eliza found herself pulled into Storm Voice's arms. They danced slowly, their steps unpolished but perfect, her head resting against his chest, where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Look," he murmured, nodding toward the edge of the clearing. Thomas stood there, watching. After a long moment, he raised his cup in a hesitant toast. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning. Eliza smiled and tightened her arms around her husband. Around them, the fire crackled, the music swelled, and the prairie stretched out vast and endless under the stars, a world reborn. The years unfolded like the petals of the wild prairie roses. Slowly, sweetly, each season layering upon the last in a tapestry of quiet joy and hard-won peace. Eliza's cabin, once a solitary outpost on the edge of the wilderness, had grown into something far greater. A second room now hugged its side, built by Storm Voice's hands with logs hewn from the oak grove to the west. A garden sprawled behind it, where corn and beans climbed sturdy poles beside squash vines that curled like sleeping children in the sun. And always, always, there were voices, laughter, chatter, the occasional squabble, filling the air where silence had once reigned. Dawn, their firstborn, was 5 years old now, a whirlwind of energy with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She could ride almost before she could walk, thanks to Storm Voice's patient teaching, and often tore across the grasslands on her spotted pony, her braids flying behind her like banners. Little Hawk, no longer so little, trailed after her with the solemn dignity of an 8-year-old who fancied himself a warrior already, though his resolve always cracked when Dawn tickled him behind the ears. And then there was the baby, Morning Star, plump and rosy-cheeked, who slept in a cradle hung from the rafters and gurgled with delight whenever Storm Voice lifted her high into the air. Eliza would watch them from the doorway, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's baking, her heart so full it ached. The settlement had changed, too. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was trade. Comanche furs and beadwork exchanged for settlers' iron tools and seed grain. The children played together, their games a mix of hide-and-seek and stories of buffalo hunts. Thomas, though he still carried the old wariness in his shoulders, had taken to joining Storm Voice on hunts when the game grew scarce. It was an uneasy alliance, but it held. One evening, as the fireflies blinked lazily over the meadow, Eliza sat on the porch with Storm Voice, their shoulders touching. Dawn and Little Hawk sprawled in the grass nearby, arguing good-naturedly over what seemed the bigger frog down by the creek. Morning Star dozed in Eliza's arms, her tiny fingers curled around her mother's thumb. "It's strange," Eliza mused, her voice soft. "When I found Little Hawk in the snow that night, I thought God had sent me a burden. But he was really giving me a gift. All of this, it was a gift." Storm Voice nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the last streaks of sunset painted the sky. "The Great Spirit works in whispers," he said. "Sometimes it takes a lifetime to hear them." A comfortable silence settled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, and the children's laughter rose like music into the twilight. Eliza closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and warm earth. There would be more storms ahead, of that she had no doubt. More winters, more challenges, more moments when the old fears would try to creep back in. But for now, under this wide and starry sky, with her husband's hand warm in hers and her children's voices ringing clear in the dusk, the world felt exactly as it should be, and that, she knew, was the greatest miracle of all.